I'm Nick Archer. I'm the British ambassador here, but in a former life, I was what we call an Arabist. I would sort of describe myself these days as a recidivist Arabist. One of the reasons I'm here in Denmark is that for the last decade I've been, no, not for the last decade, but for the last 6 years I've rather been in flight from the Middle East, and I'll explain why in a minute or two. It's nice to be back in Aarhus. This is my third similar event here. It's great to have the opportunity, but it's particularly good to come and talk about this for, I guess, 2 or 3 reasons. I mean, the first, and this is the only quote I'm going to consult my notes for, just to kind of establish where we're coming from as the British, is, I just want to quote William Hague, who said that a couple of months ago, our country, the United Kingdom, has a compelling interest in seeing the nations of the wider Middle East move towards more open societies, political systems, and economies. So to the extent that this discussion today is part of that debate, how we get this forward movement William Hague referred to, then it's professionally well worthwhile. But as I said, I was for many years in that bit of the British Foreign Office that's stigmatized, in particular by the Israelis, as being Arabist. I lived in Jordan in the late 80s, and then from London, travelled very extensively and looked after the Near East and North Africa for 3 years in the early 2000s. And the reason I'm speaking before Sus is because, as you'll see, she's much more up to date than I am. The last thing I wanted to mention before I get into the substance, though, is that, as any of you who've lived in that part of the world will know, you get kind of tangled up with it, and you make your personal relationships, and you become particularly attached to particular countries. And I'll give you a quick example of that. The Libya crisis, when that all started happening, I had a phone call from a guy I hadn't spoken to for 3 or 4 years, who was a Libyan, who lived in London. And he said, Nick, he said, I've been organizing my Libyan friends in London and down the Gulf to try and provide support and supplies to the rebels, I guess they were called back then, in Benghazi. And I said, Ahmed, that's fantastic, but why are you telling me? He said, I need fuel oil for the power station. Can you get it for me? I said, well, I'm sitting in Copenhagen, but since you ask, I'll do my best. And I'm not sure that we did, but it was this sort of weird, sudden voice from the past coming back in this very, very acute and current and contemporary situation on that basis that, in my experience, you often find in the Middle East where out of sight is out of mind, but as soon as you see somebody again, it's like you never went away, and maybe that's why what's going on at the moment drags me back as it does. So let me give you a quick British perspective, and it's going to be a mixture of a fairly straightforward sense of where the government I represent is coming from, but also mixed up with some personal impressions. And when we get into the Q&A after the break, which we've been told we're going to have, we can maybe pick up on some of those bits around the edges, some of the whys and wherefores of our government policy, maybe even 1 or 2 of its, dare I say, imperfections. First of all, though, I hate the phrase the Arab Spring. And I think we can get a little bit overexcited, and this is where the historical perspective comes in. Because there's a lot that exists today that existed when I was in Jordan in the 80s. And let's just run through the negatives and the positives. I mean, on the negative side, the huge thing that still exists, still stands there, particularly this week in New York, is the fact that we've failed to resolve the Palestinian problem. That's thing one. Thing two to remember, of course, is that this new Middle East is only just beginning. Most countries are still sort of substantially untouched by what we've seen going on in a few since the beginning of this year. Thing three, and this concerns me very much, is that the development of a monoculture in the Middle East continues apace. Personally, I worry intensely and often about the fact that Christian Arabs are quitting and going to Canada and Australia and elsewhere, and nothing yet has changed in that respect. And then the last thing I would say is that 1 or 2 of these countries where we've seen protests, there have been moments of hope, don't, in my judgment, so we can talk about this later, seem to be going anywhere. And Bahrain and Yemen, I guess, are the two sort of slightly uncertain cases. Then, before we get too excited about a sudden upsurge of democracy in the region, it's worth remembering that for years, both Lebanon and Palestine have been, in a kind of rough-hewn way, democratic societies. It's worth remembering that actually since I was in Jordan in the 80s, we've seen this extraordinary coming into being of media like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. Now, I guess most of you just take it for granted, but I still can't quite get my head around the fact that these free and hugely influential media organizations existed in the middle of the Middle East that we knew until December the 10th last year. And I went onto my own ministry's website yesterday morning, and I printed off a long list of freedoms and partial freedoms that already exist in the Middle East, already existed at the end of last year. So, we should be very careful not to suppose that what we're seeing now is entirely new or is from an excessively low baseline. We shouldn't exaggerate how low the baseline is. All that said, obviously the last months have been pretty exciting, and there are a couple of reasons I'd like to share with you why they've been exciting for me. And the first is, and again, I sort of look out there, I'm frustrated by the TV lights, but when they go off later, I'll be able to see who I'm talking to. Anyone who's lived in the Middle East over the last 20, 30 years knew that change was going to come. And we would sit around for hours and talk amongst ourselves and with our Arab friends about how change was going to come, but we couldn't see it. And what was so hugely significant about that sad, awful suicide of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia at the end of last year was that it showed us what the catalyst could be. And it also created a precedent which, in different ways, we now know can apply in really any of those societies. The spark that lights the revolt from the bottom. Because, of course, it goes without saying that we'd seen plenty of efforts to impose selective change from above. What we were waiting for was the genuine change coming from below. Another reason for enthusiasm, I think, is that, certainly in my judgment, Tunisia, at least, can succeed. And I want to talk not about all the countries where change is going on, but one or two in a moment. But let's start with the best case. Tunisia, I think, can succeed. It can succeed because whatever his failings, Bourguiba, back in the 60s and 70s, managed to change Tunisian society very, very fundamentally. And what I notice when I go there is, for example, the fact that women's rights aren't really an issue anymore. You've got a highly empowered and dynamic other half of the population, almost unique in the Arab world. You've got very intimate trading relationships, commercial relationships with us in Europe, tourism as well as industry and exports. You've got this continuing link with France, and of course I say this as an Englishman through gritted teeth, but the continuing link with France, which provides huge amounts of intellectual and political support now to the reformers in that country. And of course it's a relatively middle class and above all else a relatively secularized society. So although there's lots to be done, and although there's a real danger that in the Anglophone world we shall forget about Tunisia, I think so far so good. Tunisia is a reason to be cheerful. Egypt, frankly, is another matter. All to play for, all in the balance. And my favorite Danish cartoon of the last several years was not the famous one, but the one in Politiken back in the springtime, which was wordless, and so I was able to copy it to my colleagues across the world. They didn't have to understand the Danish. Picture one, a bunch of fellaheen crowbarring up a pyramid to move it. Picture two, same pyramid, different place. And that encapsulated for me the challenge of Egypt. And the reason that I worry is because of what seems to be, and one shouldn't caricature or stereotype, this historic Egyptian fondness for the pharaoh figure. It's to do perhaps more seriously with the continuing power of the army It's to do with how representative were those people in Tahrir Square of the tens of millions of peasants out there in the countryside. And it's also to revert to this favourite theme of mine, to do with the appalling levels of intercommunal violence that we've seen since the sort of so-called revolution. And the real reason that we should worry about Egypt is perhaps not even for Egypt's sake, but because, in my view, Egypt is the key to the creation or not of a lastingly new Middle East. In fact, you could go a step further, I think, and say that given Egypt's decisive influence in the Arab world, it's also a reason for some of the uncertainties that we're seeing in various of the neighbouring countries at the moment. And I would say, take Syria. If Egypt were now more firmly and more clearly heading off down the democratic path, I think that what's going on in Syria, we can talk about that in a moment, would somehow seem less iffy, would seem less in the balance. And then I did a bit of a history lesson. I don't know how many people in this room have, most of us I think, have some dim recollection of something called the United Arab Republic, which united Egypt and Syria back into the 1950s. There was also something called the United Arab States between 58 and 61, and that included North Yemen. And I find myself wondering again whether if there was more clarity in Egypt, there might be a little bit more clarity in Yemen. But anyway, I don't want to do a kind of whole tour of the region. What the organisers of this meeting asked me to do during one of our exchanges was talk a little bit about how the Western response, and specifically the British response to Libya and Syria, differed. And so let's, for a moment, take a sort of slightly more thematic and less country-specific line on the Middle East. One thing that interested me living in Jordan in the 80s, which is still an issue today, is a dilemma about where we as outside states sort of focus our efforts to support Arab reform. The dilemma back then was that you had a reforming autocrat. You had a king who was committed to economic and social reform, and you had a reasonably fairly elected parliament, actually. You know, this was one of these examples of partial democracy that I was referring to earlier that's existed for a while. But the parliament was stuffed full of reactionaries, and they didn't want any of this economic or social reform. And it wasn't a dilemma for us to resolve, but it was a particularly frustrating and difficult problem to confront and to speculate about. You know, how would one resolve that? And then 15 years later, at a gathering a bit like this, down in the south of England, I remember hearing Arab intellectuals, one after the other, arguing that the way forward for the Arab world was the Asian model. And that sounds quite benign, because maybe we think of, I don't know, Japan post-war or Singapore. But actually what most of them meant was Korea. What they meant was that within autocratic political structures, there should be a degree of economic liberalization, and then at a certain point, if everything went well, you might put the democracy issue back on the table. So these are questions, I think, which are still relevant today as we look at who to help and how to help and how much to help. I've got a fairly straightforward answer to the why in Libya and not Syria question. Again, I offer it up so that you can shoot me down. Seen from our perspective, the main reason we did military intervention in Libya was because we could, and we knew what we thought it would take us to. And actually, in this particular case, we were right. So it was something that was relatively straightforward to crank up. I mean, you might say it would have to be pretty straightforward to be doable without strong leadership from Washington. And as it's turned out, the gamble that would lead us into a newer and, broadly speaking, more positive situation in that country turned out to be right. Neither factor, in our judgment, is present at the moment, at least, in Syria. Does that make us hypocrites? I don't know. I can see why people think so. But clearly, Syria is hugely complex. I mean, I would like to have heard the Danish Air Force commentary on how doable it might be. But even if it were doable, the strategic consequences of taking out the armed forces of a country which is in some kind of strategic balance with Israel and other neighbors in the region are complex. And even if one had been able to neutralize the Syrian armed forces, the whole question of what next is, in my personal judgment, one that we need to think a lot more about and get lots more evidence on before we start flying warplanes in the skies above Syria. Syria's, I should add, really problematic for us in Britain because we believed, I think it's fair to say, in young Assad. And we believed in him perhaps for not the most profound reasons, but he'd lived in London for years and he had a very nice English wife. And you know, who wouldn't benefit hugely from those advantages? And so it's actually been quite a shock and quite a bitter shock to see that in spite of being possessed of those huge advantages, he's still ended up in the situation he has. And I would go further and say it's a bit of a tragedy for him because I think, and again, I know there's a lot of conversation about Syria in particular going on today. My judgment would be that 9 months ago, he could have stood in a free and fair presidential election on a reforming platform and won. Sad. Looking at the factors that we need for intervention, we look at the opposition and find it very fragmented, very weak, very confused, unlike Benghazi. Unlike in Libya and Tunisia, you see that real poverty is right there, if not already present, then waiting just around the corner. So, you know, I think we're right to be pretty cautious about that. Standing back, because I think I've had my 20 minutes, where do we go from here? I think there is a broad consensus. I'd be interested to test it later and to listen to Sus on this subject, that we've done some good things and we know, broadly speaking, what we have to do next. We've got to carry on helping Tunisia, not forgetting it, Libya and Egypt to succeed. And I should, sort of stepping into a more formal role here, pay tribute to what Denmark's done in each of those three cases. It's done more than its fair share, and it's been a huge force for good. The other thing we have to do is carry on remembering the lesson we learnt in Iraq, which is don't get in the way and don't impose your own agenda, except above the inevitable minimum. Thing three we have to do is sustain the pressure. Even if we don't know what the end game in Syria will be, that's not a reason for not keeping up the pressure as we have been doing on Assad. And we need not to forget the first failed revolution in Bahrain and keep up the pressure on the ruler of Bahrain and the authorities in Yemen and all the others where there is reform activity happening. It's rather unglamorous, but we need to carry on providing the economic support, not just to places like Syria, which, as I said a moment ago, are on the brink of mass poverty, but to all these countries where change is expensive, because there's a period during which normal income flows and so on are to varying degrees disrupted. We need to encourage the more reluctant reformers, but people who are nevertheless moving in the right direction, like the kings of Morocco and Jordan, to carry on with their reform programs. There are elections in Morocco next month. It's important that those are a catalyst for bottom-up change. And the King of Jordan's, again, just by way of example, committed himself to a program of democratic change, which we need to keep the pressure up on him to drive through. But then the last thing I think we do need to do, and this is maybe the most difficult aspect of all, is we need to be talking to the rest and just reminding them that the world within which they exist has changed. And that if they don't move, then there is a real danger that others will seek to move them. Finally, Palestine. Palestine for decades has been the excuse used by Arab despots not to lift emergency legislation, not to grant freedom of speech, and so on and so on and so on. So it's not only incredibly important in and for itself, but I think it's incredibly important if we're to see a genuinely new Middle East. Why do we do it? I go back to what William Hague said at the outset. We do it because we need it. One aspect of all this, for example, that's been very little commented on in the media here, or indeed in Britain, is the fact that Egypt is 80-odd million people. Syria is 22 million people. These people live next door to Europe. I mean, in many respects, as Mediterranean neighbours, they're part of Europe. It will be hugely beneficial to us as well as to them if these societies are normalised, democratised, and these people become, if you'll forgive my saying so, and in the nicest possible way, consumers. It can help us deal with some of the other huge crises that we as Europeans confront, not least the economic crisis. So, seen from a British perspective, this is win-win. We do feel a moral obligation to help people in their struggle to be free. Equally, we should be bold enough to see that whatever the temporary disruptions, it's overwhelmingly in our interests to do so. Thank you.
Well, it's always hard to follow the British because they are in command of the language, but I'll try and do as best as I can. Just very quickly, the structure of what I'm going to say, and focusing a lot on what is it we are doing to support the Arab uprising as it's moving on, and with the focus on Egypt, Libya, and Syria. First of all, I want to say a little bit about the policies until 2010, because that's been discussed in Denmark. And the way we saw things in the Middle East, and here I would like to say, it's not that we have overlooked the enormous difficulties there were in these countries. The high and rising unemployment among youth, corruption, nepotism, lack of political freedom. I mean, all this we knew, and we were all talking, as Nick said, we all talk about when is something going to happen, but nobody expected it to be 2011. So it's just to say that there was an enormous focus on this and discussions, and we had it in our scenarios at some time, but I think it was down for 15, 16, 20, that something might happen. What were we doing? We were supporting stability in these countries, because that was the Arab leaders. If you want the Middle East not to end up in a big Islamic region where Al-Qaeda will have enormous influences, this is what you should do. This was what we were told by Mubarak and, of course, Israel every day. But at the same time, we were also supporting economic development in this region. For the reasons which Nick mentioned, we want to see this region develop. We don't want them to be migrants into Europe. We want them to be prosperous, to see them buying consumer goods from Europe, and we want them to see them free and happy. So of course there was enormous programs going on from the European Union in support of economic development. And I would like to say that we were also very concerned about freedoms, and that was the reason for the Arab Initiative, which was initiated by the Danish government in in 2003, I think, 2004, which was exactly to try and build cooperation with human rights organizations, women's organizations, civil society, in its embryonic form, because there is not much civil society in most of these countries, but we were having this cooperation as much as we could. And luckily, it turns out that some of these people which we have known during these programs and we've been working together with for 5-6 years are now the people we're seeing leading these revolutions, which has also been really interesting. Nick mentioned the Middle East peace process. One reason for keeping good relations with all the Arab countries was also, of course, this was seen as a tiny part of the puzzle to somehow solve the Middle East peace process, whatever is left of it. When the uprising started, Tunisia went so fast that not many people in Denmark really realized what happened. And we share this general notion that we think Tunisia is going to succeed. It has a very educated population. It has strong institutions, which of course need to be reformed, but they're there. So I'm not going to say much more about that. We're going to support it a lot. It's going to be a main recipient of Danish support through the Freedom Fund, which will maybe have a new name now with a new government, but I'm sure that this new government will also like to support whatever kind of democratization is going on in Tunisia. But the basic notion was support the protesters. This is what we wanted to do, a very sort of human rights, democratization, freedom agenda. We were not talking so much about our own national interests. We were talking about these high moral goals. This is why we're doing this. We want to see freedom in these countries. We want to see these people have dignity, because that was what they were crying for when they were standing in Tahrir Square in these days. And on February 11th, things changed. We asked Mubarak to step down. And I think the Danish Prime Minister at that time was really lucky, because he managed to say that 4 hours before he actually was forced to leave. So we were out there in front, and everybody felt, well, wow, we are on the right tide, and things are moving. But the question is, who are these people in Tahrir Square? Who are they? Who supports them? And it's the same which can be said for the protesters all over the region. So I think what we have, as civil servants, we have been trying to promote a lot, is to, rather than focus on people, focus on, and that's also something I learned from Jørgen Elklit and our long work on democratization processes, focus on institutions. Build the institutions, build the processes, make sure that that's what's working and that's what you're arguing for, rather than pinning your hope on one person here or there, and then if that fails, you have nothing. So it's again, support the institutions, support the processes. And that's why, just very quickly on Egypt, and because you can say in Egypt, not much has changed. And I think that's also coming, and that's also being realized by all the young protesters in Tahrir Square, and sometimes they go back to the square to try and put the agenda back in the right, where it should be. Because for all fairness, it's still the military there. But we are waiting, and we are pressing, and we are telling the military and the government, which is sort of sitting in front of the military, you have to keep the roadmap. You have to hold these parliamentary elections you have promised, have the constitutional process, and then the presidential elections. Stick to the roadmap. And I think you will see mounting pressure on Egypt to stick to the roadmap as these timelines come nearer. The first timeline the first date is end of November. And while we are saying all this, we all know that human rights atrocities, the security forces are still in play in Egypt, picking up people. And of course, this is not acceptable. So we will continue to drive that agenda very forcefully. And then at the same time, we're also trying to support the economy. If the revolutions cannot deliver anything, people will be really frustrated, and they will go back to do what they've been doing all the time, namely being not very interested in politics. So we have to see some kind of economic progress. And here the European Union is playing a big role through its Mediterranean Partnerships Program, and we are pushing really hard to get more money transferred from the East Europe program also to the Mediterranean programs. Libya is, of course, the big thing. And here I tend to agree with what was said by Nick before. There was a military intervention because it was doable. And of course, it's not something, we are saying because it's, of course, our governments talk together, and this was part of the whole thing. What was driving the Danish decision to be the first country on its wings, going through the parliament in the quickest time ever. We've never seen three parliamentary debates in one afternoon and evening to make sure that we could be the first ones there. It's impressive. The argumentation was all the way through, if you look at what the politicians said in parliament, it's our responsibility to protect the civilians who were going to be massacred in Benghazi. This was the sole reason why we did it. Then I hope that we will get something out of it also in the longer run, that it's not only for our high moral ground, that we will have great relations with Libya and others in the Arab world, and that we will be looked upon as a country who really stood up for our what we normally say, our human rights agenda. One big argument which was also used in Denmark for why we were capable of supporting a military intervention, or the no-fly zone, it's not a military intervention, it's no-fly zone and bombardments, was that the Arab countries asked for it. It was a regional demand that they wanted this. So this was, you can say, we're listening to countries in the region, what do you think is the best way forward? And then the decision was to go and to be this partner, and we have been a very big partner in this, and much beyond what could be reasonably expected from us. But that was the decision by the government to do that. Can I also say it was very interesting because the European countries here took the lead. It was UK and France who all the way through took the lead. I'm sure there will afterwards be plenty of research on why did that happen. Was it because of internal politics, Sarkozy wanting to raise his national agenda? Or was it, I mean, there will be so much research on this, and we all look forward to that. Personally, and I said that jokingly to Nick, I said it's because UK and France wants to make sure that even though the European Union looks a bit, maybe not so powerful as it could be, it's important for European countries to show that they continue to deserve the seats they have, the permanent seats they have in the UN Security Council. He said we would be there for 20 years. I thought that was a good answer. But clearly, I mean, it is interesting that the European countries decided to do this on their own. Of course, the United States in the backing, and don't be misled. And I don't think I'm telling anything which is not known. It could not have been done without US, because they were there and they have the capacities and capabilities, and I'm sure you also talked about that before. It could not have been done without the United States in the background. The other reason why Libya is as was also said before, is different. There was a recognized opposition. There were people who were organized and ready to go forward. We were not really, in the beginning there was all this discussion, are they really representative? And I still don't think we know whether they are, but they have been accepted in the international community as representative of the Libyan population. Of course, we still have to, the proof is in the pudding. We still have to see that. And of course it's very important as TNC moves forward that they show that they are capable of making an inclusive political process, that they don't lose out on important tribes or the whole West, for example, because traditionally Libya was 3 states, and so if they lose out on all of the West and just have the East as the leading force, we will be in for long-term trouble. So there's still a question mark over whether we will actually have democracy and the rule of law, but to be fair, they come off, I think they've come off the ground really well. And compared to where they were 3 or 4 months ago, they've done fantastically. On Syria, I don't think there's any, Syria is another case. In Syria, there is all these reasons to be really, really careful. Like the rest of the European Union countries, like was said before, UK, we all hoped that the young Assad was willing to reform. But it turned out that the security forces and his mother is probably stronger than his. So they've taken over the rule of the country, and he and his beautiful wife is maybe not so powerful any longer as they used to be. And so now we are in the situation where we see that they're really, really crushing down. There is the hope that there will be reforms there is really dim. There were some promises, but they have never been fulfilled. But the big problem is, again, I mean, here we have a very, very scattered opposition. And of course, it is scattered because the regime is so strong. So it's really, really difficult for anybody to take up any opposition in such a country. The opposition outside Syria is also very fragmented and have very little linkages to whatever is going on inside Syria. So it's a very, very difficult situation. We are, through the programs which we're having, trying to support as much as we can. Media support, some of these videos that are coming out are also things we have been involved in. I mean, some of the things we can do very, very little in a country like Syria. Very little. Because it's so, the security forces there are so strong. So what we do is to try and put sanctions. Does it have any impact? Very limited. It's not that the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, and the people around him or the security forces is going to give up anything because of sanctions. But I do think the sanctions have had an impact at a certain stage. For a long time, it was only very fragmented groups that were supporting the uprising. But now it seems that because of the economic difficulties the sanctions are actually giving to the population, broader parts of the population are joining these forces that are seeking reforms. The problem is we don't know much about these forces. We don't know really who they are or what they want. And also we don't know how it's going to play into the regional balances, whatever kind of regime will arise from any reform process in Syria. So it's a very, very difficult situation in Syria. What we have done is, and that's where we have a much easier agenda, because we just support human rights and democracy. We have this high moral agenda. We can just go out and say, human rights and democracy must be upheld at any time, at any cost. So this is what we do at this time. Where's the Arab world going? Much too early to say. I think there's one thing which is really, really sad, also because I know some of these guys who were at Tahrir Square. They are not going to run Egypt. They are just so nice. They don't understand these politics. They don't understand what it takes to really get around all these cronies and military guys who are now in power there. I mean, they're going to be, people will look at them and think of them as some people who made changes at a certain stage in Egyptian history, but I don't think they're ever going to run the country. And that's really sad, because there's a lot of good people there. Hopefully they will join forces and parties and be represented in parliament when the parliamentary elections go forward, but we'll see how that works out. So some of the old power structures, the militaries, they are strong, and they know how to run these things, and they know all the backroom deals that needs to be made in processes like this. So it's a difficult position. Where will the Muslim Brotherhood be? Where will the Muslim forces be? I think it's fair to say that they are the best organized in all these countries. They're best organized in Syria, they're best organized in Tunisia, they're best organized in Egypt. So of course they will have a strong say. So maybe it is right that we can choose either being between stability or Islam. But I would say it this way, yes, we may have Islam, but I think it will be they will be very keen to show themselves as very moderate Islam. And of course this is, if you have democratic processes and you have there will be moderate Islamic parties, because Islam is a very important part in these countries, and we shouldn't shy away from understanding that this is the case. But of course our interest is that it's moderate Islam that comes into the front. Then that whole question of the non-reformers, what are we going to do about those? Are we going to push for reforms in these countries? It's really, really, it's difficult to see what we can do in a place like Saudi Arabia. We have not been very successful in supporting reforms in Iran. We're still hoping that the Green Revolution somehow will show its face again, and we can pay more attention to it than we did in 2009, where we really left it. I mean, we just left them to themselves. But there wasn't much we could do at that time. I think it's interesting to think about the regional power balances, because it's, for a long time we have been seeing Turkey as an example which more people should be looking to in the Arab world. Because there you had economic growth, you had a country that really showed the way forward. An Islamic state that could show how you have democracy and economic growth, employment, opportunities for the young people. So this was sort of a model. And will they go that way, these countries? We don't know. Turkey is trying to play a big role there, but they are maybe now, right now, maybe they're overstretching themselves. And then there's a whole impact on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. There is no doubt that these countries who are now coming into, or these governments that are now coming into force in the Arab countries will be more demanding on having a solution. They're not just, I mean, these popular movements will demand a solution. They will demand from their governments that there will be a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there'll be much more pressure on having a solution. And I think that's also what we're seeing now with the Palestinian move towards more recognition. I'm phrasing it like that because they're not going, I don't think they're going to ask for recognition, but more recognition in the UN Security Council. Opportunities for the West? I think there are. I mean, for all this talk, and I'm sure, I don't know when anybody went to talk to and listen to my colleague, Ambassador Hoppe from Cairo, who were at another session. He's talking about the Arab autumn now. And I think that's too pessimistic. I think we still have to play. I mean, we still have to play on all these things that's going on. And I think there are so many opportunities for the West to do things in the countries where reforms are happening. And we really have to show that we are ready to be there. That's primarily in Tunisia, Egypt, and hopefully also in Syria, but also in Palestine. Show these people that we are there, that we are willing to support them in their quest for more freedom, but also support them economically, so they can have a better life and have better opportunities, more jobs, more economic growth. So I think there is enormous impacts, or things that the West could gain from having a more prosperous Mediterranean region. I just want to say a little bit about the international context, because I think all this is happening on a backdrop of where you see China, India, and these countries coming to the forefront. It is really interesting how they have managed this. I mean, how we have... Are we seeing the last time that the West is capable of doing something on responsibility to protect? Is this the West's last show on human rights, moral high ground, telling the world what is the way forward? I don't hope so. Certainly I don't hope so. But if you look at how these countries have been behaving and how they've been reacting in the Security Council, I just think it's fantastic that we are where we are in Libya. Had we been in a stalemate on Libya, that Gaddafi has still been sitting in Tripoli, I don't think it would be very, very funny to go to the UN General Assembly being Cameron or Sarkozy at this time. Because when Jabao and Manmohan Singh would be looking at him and saying, what are you doing, guys? You failed in Afghanistan, you failed in Iraq, you failed, now you're failing Libya. So what are you doing? Luckily, I don't know, I wouldn't say luckily, because of course it was all calibrated. We all knew what we were doing. We are doing very well in Libya. So now what we're seeing is, of course, Chinese pragmatism. So what happened the day that Gaddafi left in Tripoli? China has been, going on that this was misusing the no-fly zone means there's absolutely no planes. But you have been sending in your planes in a no-fly zone. But now, at the day that Gaddafi left, what happened in Beijing? The TNC flag went up, same day. And China sent the first economic mission to Libya to make sure that they have their oil contracts as well. I mean, they are pragmatic people. They will make sure that they get business out of anything. So I just thought that was really interesting. But it is this is, I think, I mean, I really hope that this is not this for the what we are seeing in the United Nations, what we are seeing globally, that these countries, that the BRIC countries becoming more forceful, becoming more powerful, it will mean less intervention. It will mean that they will say, these countries will have to do what they have to do. Revolutions will have to take its course. You shouldn't interfere in that. That's the whole sort of, don't get involved in other countries, the position they have. But I think it's interesting where this will take us, because we had this success in Libya. Maybe we can see it in other situations as well. Where will Europe go from here? I think Europe we have been split on a lot of this. We've been split on Libya. We had Germany, who were voted together with other countries. I mean, didn't vote together with UK and France in the Security Council. I think we have reunited the European Union again, and I think the European Union is very well aware that if we want to be a strong global force in the future, we need to make sure that there is prosperity and stability in our immediate neighborhood, and that's the Mediterranean. So I think the European Union will know that we have to invest now. It is our opportunity to stay on the global scene as a global power and make sure that this scenario, which a lot of people have been talking about, the G2, the China-United States scenario, will not happen. I think I'll stop here because I think we should have more time for questions. I think that'll be better. Right?